Okay, guys, so this last unit we've been talking about is called sectionalism. And remember, that's the time period right before the Civil War. And we've already started talking about sectionalism with Washington's farewell address. He divided the nation into the North, the South, and the West. We've been talking about that too. Sectional differences between the North and South was industry in the North, agriculture in the South. You could talk about the growing season, different places. Infrastructure, much more infrastructure in the North than there was the South and the West. One of the first real events that we see in sectionalism, well, it's actually probably the Kentucky and Virginia Resolution. We can go all the way back to John Adams when he got past the Alien Sedition Acts. Sorry, thinking it's late. Remember, the southern states, Kentucky and Virginia, thought these were unconstitutional, and they nullified federal law. Of course, we know that they can't nullify them. The next time this happens is when Andrew Jackson creates a protective tariff. Remember, a protective tariff protects American manufacturing because it rises the price of foreign goods. So this protective tariff gets passed, and the South is upset because it's going to make their life a little bit more expensive. They have to pay more money for stuff. So, they don't want to do that, and they want to nullify it. Andrew Jackson gets real mad, and he asks Congress if he can send troops in. And, cooler heads prevailed and said, all right, we're going to slow this tariff down just a little bit. So that's really our first case of sectionalism. It was called that tariff of abomination. But guys, remember that term, nullification. The Regents is going to ask you about it. So with this sectionalism, one of the main differences between the northern states and the southern states is really the issue of slavery. The plantation owners very much need to protect the institution of slavery. It's been their way of life really since the early 1600s when we started to settle in Virginia. And of course, in the north, it's all about what we called free labor. Of course, free labor wasn't free. They had to pay for the people working in the factories. But those people in the North didn't want to lose their factory jobs. So they certainly do not want slavery instituted anywhere in the North. So we start to see this abolitionist movement. And one of the first characters that we talk about is one of the bravest women in American history. And her name was Harriet Tubman. Remember, she was a runaway slave. She escaped to Pennsylvania, and there she felt that she was truly free, but she found out that her family was going to get torn apart. That often happened to slave families in the South. Children would be sold off, husband, wives, brothers, sisters. So she goes back into the South using the Underground Railroad. Remember, the Underground Railroad was not underground. It was a series of safe houses. It was a series of trails through swamps and hills and mountains in order to get the African Americans, north into Pennsylvania. Of course, that lasts till 1850, and in 1850, that Fugitive Slave Act is passed. Sorry, my dog's barking. That Fugitive Slave Act now says that if you're a runaway slave, we can go into the North, capture you, and bring you back. Now, this is really going to tick off some abolitionists, and it will get African American escaped slaves to go all the way to Canada. The next abolitionist we talked about in class was Frederick Douglass. Remember, he is also an escaped slave, but he's an educated African American. And remember, one of the reasons that Southern plantation owners said that, we can't stop slavery. Oh my God, I'm making a video. That we can't stop slavery is that African Americans could not be educated. So obviously, Frederick Douglass proved them wrong. He wrote this book called The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. He also worked with Abraham Lincoln, the president of the United States moving into the Civil War. So he was someone that was a little different from Harriet Beecher Stowe. He didn't return to the South. He thought the way to end slavery was through laws and political movements. He was also kind of a radical because he was one of these guys that also talked about giving women the right to vote. And that was not something that people were ready to tackle yet either. So two other abolitionists that we talked about, and I'm going to try and get through both of these guys with no interruptions. was William Lloyd Garrison. Remember, he printed the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator. Okay, it was a radical newspaper, edited and published by William Lloyd Garrison. And remember, why I say is radical is because he called for emancipation of slaves now. He even called for enfranchisement. And remember, we defined enfranchisement in class is making African Americans citizens and giving them the right to vote. So that's the radical ideas, because even people in the North were not ready to call African Americans citizens nor give them the right to vote. There's also Harriet Beecher Stowe. Remember, she writes the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's a fictional book based on reality of what was going on in the South. She was interviewing African Americans to try and understand the atrocities that they faced in the South. This was a bestseller in the North. And really what this book did is people who hadn't experienced slavery. You know, it's one of those things like we have not experienced terrorism for the most part. So I think it's very easy for us to say, oh man, that's awful. And that's what a lot of people in the North were doing about slavery. They hadn't really experienced it. They read Uncle Tom's Cabin, and suddenly these people are on the fence, not really sure if it's good or bad, really shift to the side of we need to end slavery. Okay, so that's people in the North talking. It wasn't the government, it was people in the North. But the people in the South really think that the government is the one saying that we should end slavery. And I'll be honest with you guys, Abraham Lincoln really never said that he would end slavery when he was running for president of the United States. When we were writing the Constitution, well, I wasn't, I'm not that old, but when our founding fathers were writing the Constitution in the 1780s, they talked about dealing with the issue of slavery. But it was so ingrained in the South that the Southern founding fathers didn't really want to change it. Plantation life and slave labor was how they were able to control so many acres and become so rich. So they're going to leave it up to us as the years go by. We are going to deal with it once again in 1820. It's called the Missouri Compromise, okay, or the Compromise of 1820. The Regents will put it both ways. Here's what happens. There's an equal number of slave states and free states, 12 and 12. Missouri has organized, the Missouri Territory has organized and wants to come into the nation, but it wants to come into the nation as a slave state. Well, that won't make the Northerners very happy. So here's what the compromise is. They divide the country in half, the new territories that will come in at the 3630 line. Any states that are organized above the 3630 line, except for Missouri, will come in as a free state. States that organize below the 3630 line will come in as a slave state. And to balance out the slave states versus free states, we're going to let Maine come into the Union. So now it'll be 1313. Thus, the Missouri Compromise is going to stave off the Civil War for a few years. Okay, so this Missouri Compromise is going to be a compromise for all of 30 years. We're going to have another compromise, a very catchy compromise. It's called the Compromise of 1850. And it really comes about because California has organized itself because of the gold rush, and suddenly California is saying, hey, we want in. Here's one of the big problems. The 3630 line goes directly through the state of California. All right, and it was going to throw off the balance of states. Now, the compromise is this. Yeah, California, come on in, and you're going to be a free state. But what makes the South happy is the Fugitive Slave Act, and we've talked about that already. Remember, the Fugitive Slave Act says if you're a runaway slave, you get to the North, but we capture you, and we can prove that you're a slave, we're bringing you back. And of course, there was going to be free African-American men and women who would live their entire life as free people who would be enslaved under this Fugitive Slave Act. So in only 30 years, yeah, we staved it off once again. Okay, but then in 1854, we need another compromise because the Kansas-Nebraska territory has organized itself, and now it's ready to become a state. So, both sides are fighting, free state, slave state, free state, slave state. Okay, so what they come up with is this term called popular sovereignty. And what popular sovereignty means is, well, hey, let's let the people vote. Let's let them decide right then nobody can really get mad at us being the government. Well, here's what happens. People in the Kansas territory at first rush in there. You have radical abolitionists, people like John Brown, and then you have other people who are pro-slavery rushing into the territory. Okay, and this is going to create something called Bleeding Kansas. They're going to kill each other over this. John Brown, in fact, is going to break into pro-slavery house, and they're going to murder kids and a couple of the adults. But remember, John Brown was a martyr, to the Northernists. But to the South, of course, he's a terrorist, or he's a murderer. But again, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, is that going to solve the problem of this sectionalism? Absolutely not. And then of course Abraham Lincoln is going to get elected to become president of the United States. And again, the South thought this was all coming from the government, and it wasn't. It was coming from Northern abolitionists. But when Abraham Lincoln gets elected president, South Carolina secedes. And wow, the Civil War is about to begin.